Finally, Europe is also offering Bitcoin ETFs, and it's crazier than you can imagine. Or should I say it differently? Europe is being forced to offer Bitcoin ETFs because you can't get around Bitcoin, and anyone who shuts themselves off from Bitcoin sooner or later has to accept the truth that you can't ignore Bitcoin. Now BlackRock is rolling out its offering to Europe and hosting its European Bitcoin ETF program here, where it will now also be possible for retailers, for institutions, and so on, buying Bitcoin. And folks, you know what a big deal that was. Here in the USA, how massively this has hit here. The same thing is now rolling out in Europe. The Freedom Friends in Brussels and co. They might not like it, but you just can't get around it. This whole thing is launching in Switzerland. We'll take a look at that in just a moment, but we'll also take a look at a massive new Bitcoin prediction later on. According to Standard Chartered, they expect that during the Trump era, as long as Trump is in office, until he gets voted out again or steps down from his position, Bitcoin will rise here to at least $500,000. And Standard Chartered also had a very, very interesting prediction about the Bitcoin ETFs, because they were expecting that the Bitcoin ETFs are going to hit like a bomb. They're now making the $500,000 call. They were definitely right about the Bitcoin call, because if there's one thing that has really taken off, it's the Bitcoin ETFs. And that's crazy. We need to check this out now, because the laggards, the Thunderlines, and so on, they're all not into Bitcoin. And now Bitcoin is coming to the European area and is being introduced here. Maybe it will hit just as hard as it did in the U.S. The likelihood is definitely there. And that means that BlackRock will significantly increase its assets under management. BlackRock is already kind of short on cash. Through the Bitcoin ETFs, they've accumulated around 570,000 or something like that. And now you can increase your assets under management again. Hey guys, crazy, what's going on here? Lottie writes here, probably nothing. So, maybe nothing is going to happen here. This is just the Bitcoin ETF from BlackRock. He holds 527,000 Bitcoin here in the US. So my numbers were wrong here. Now an ETP is supposed to follow in Europe. So that's the story now. Officially, this is not an ETF, but an ETP, because here in Europe, ETFs must be diversified for regulatory reasons. So there can't be a Bitcoin spot ETF. That's of course just more of the clown regulations in Europe or the EU. Why can't there be Bitcoin ETFs here in the EU? Yeah, because then it has to contain two values. Otherwise, this is officially not an ETF, and that's just ridiculous. Why don't we look at the USA and look at how they're doing it there? I mean, the Bitcoin ETFs were such a huge success. And now they just say, yeah, in Europe, it always has to have two values. I mean, this isn't new regulation. The regulation has been around for a long time. But now, the ETP is basically being rolled out here in Europe. In the end, it really doesn't matter whether it's called an ETF or an ETP. I think I even said ETF right at the beginning, so when I say ETF, I mean ETP. In the end, what's important is that people have a vehicle here to buy Bitcoin. Access to Bitcoin is being made even easier here. Although I'm always a big critic of ETFs or ETFs when you don't have your own keys here. That's why there's always this big recommendation. I'm putting a link down below to a TREZOR hardware that shows how you can easily, securely, and simply hold your Bitcoin in self-sovereignty. Without BlackRock, without the stock exchange. Completely censorship resistant, without any third party like Larry Fink or anything like that being able to interfere. And with the code Bitcoin HODL, you also get 10% off when buying one of those Bitcoin hardware wallet. So I'm putting a link down below for you, totally recommend it. ETF expert Eric Balkunas says that BlackRock is preparing to launch a spot Bitcoin ETF in Europe based in Switzerland. So he's talking about an ETF again. I'm not really sure if it's going to be called ETP or ETF later on. The amount of the fees is not yet known. It will be very variable. US ETFs, they outshine the rest of the world in terms of costs and liquidity. But either way, it shows the commitment of the world's largest asset manager with a strong presence abroad. And that's basically the massive wave now. We've also seen the crazy price rally in 2024 was definitely triggered to a large extent by the Bitcoin ETFs here. And we already have Bitcoin ETFs here that are buying more Bitcoin every day. When they come into circulation, when they are bought. And just imagine, the product offering is now being rolled out. Here, the whole European Union, and so on, they still have all the Bitcoin. Then it's obviously a massive catalyst, although I have to honestly say, Europe is obviously a joke of a market compared to the US market. The US market is the key market here. And Europe, like so often, it's once again the little brother or little sister or something like that who then tags along. That means the US is leading the way and then Europe just lags behind, missing the boat. And at some point you wake up here from your coma and realize, hey crap, we need ETFs too, crap, we need Bitcoin too, crap, we have to open this up, crap, we can't shut ourselves off, crap, we can't ban it either. And then in the end, the ETF is there. And then you realize, crap, we missed the whole party. All the first mover advantages, gone. Through which could it all have been done? Germany has sold its Bitcoin. The EU is regulating Bitcoin to death with MiCA. And who knows what else, other countries are just moving ahead here. And in the end, the countries here have better regulations than Europe and are therefore ultimately the market leaders here too. It's also said by Eric Balciunas that Europe hardly ranks on the best list of spot Bitcoin ETFs by size. Spot is obviously a bit of a joke here. US spot ETFs are only a year old and have a global share of 91%. We are absolutely amazing. When it comes to costs and liquidity, if BlackRock brings even a fraction of the US investors over there, it should be a success. Although you should keep in mind that Europeans are much less into it. Spicy sauce stands out like the US and definitely some Asian countries. So that basically means that Europe probably won't be as strong here. And it won't hit as hard as the U.S. This is going to get pretty crazy, but not ultra crazy. So to put this in simple terms, this whole thing has very, very bullish vibes, but not quite Valhalla vibes yet. The ETFs in the US definitely had those Valhalla vibes. And the Bitcoin ETFs here in the EU aren't quite as crazy, but they're still crazy. The most exciting thing happening here, though, is really game theory. Here, British HODL also says that Europe will soon be forced to embrace Bitcoin. BlackRock just announced that they will be launching exchange-traded Bitcoin products in Europe. Thank goodness, because the EU bureaucrats will never get smart. And that's basically the right sentence he's bringing up here. That in the end, you can't shut yourself off from Bitcoin. The EU has banned it. Or, well, what am I saying? The EU hasn't banned it, but they've basically made it really difficult. Companies here are getting into Bitcoin, using Bitcoin somehow, I don't know, to make it appealing to people. There were so many regulations still around. If you have an exchange here in the EU, you're way more stuck than if you're somewhere outside the EU. And that's why some people are heading to Switzerland, to the US, to El Salvador, or whatever, wherever. And in the end, yeah, they don't outright ban it, but they make the regulation so difficult that it has a ban-like structure, at least for some business sectors. And then at some point, you'll be forced by the market to use Bitcoin here. Because if you don't use it, then in the end, it's just like not using a car. Yeah, it kind of works. You can live without a car, but it's just crap when you somehow know that I have to drive from Germany to Spain. And then you have to do it on a bike instead of in a car. And it's kind of the same with Bitcoins. You can get by without them. You can live without Bitcoin. I mean, I lived a long time in my life without Bitcoin, but it sucked. It wasn't as great as with Bitcoin, because with Bitcoin, things are just a lot easier. We had, for example, here yesterday, BlackRock is buying another 2,500 Bitcoin, and we keep seeing news like this that BlackRock is buying. Here, 3,000 Bitcoin, 4,000 Bitcoin, 1,000 Bitcoin. Sometimes there are outflows, but we're seeing almost no outflows, and that could definitely continue. That the inflows at BlackRock are going to get even crazier, because the space is just getting bigger. Here, the research guy from Hey Apollo also says, which is really, really interesting, and that is on the day the US government announces that it's buying Bitcoin. The price will shoot up by $50,000 in a single 1-minute candle. Don't get caught off guard. And there have been discussions about that, for example, because Larry Fink mentioned it in his speech at Davos. Yeah, he's in touch with people, with sovereign funds, with civil and wealth funds that might buy Bitcoin here. And then it basically came down to, okay, which sovereign fund could that be? Who could that be? I then said back then, okay, it can't be the USA. There's no sovereign fund or anything like that. That's why the US won't be buying BlackRock Bitcoin ETFs and so on. And now Howard Lutnick has launched the Southern Wealth Fund here in the U.S. And now suddenly says, okay, the US is starting a Southern Wealth Fund. And now it all comes together. Now you suddenly realize, hey, maybe Larry Fink has actually communicated with Howard Lutnick. After all, or Howard Lutnick is the one who's pushing this forward a bit, Bitcoin. That's not Howard Lutnick who's hosting the wealth fund here. It's not just hosting, but of course it's here. Scott Besson.
And Donald Trump signed the executive order for that.
But Howard Lutnick is of course also part of the organizing team. And then it could actually be that the US isn't buying Bitcoin directly here. But if they're already in contact here with Larry Fink. But like I said, everything in quotes, speculations, I don't have any exact information. Would just make sense. Because, let's say, Larry Fink talks about it. Then 2 weeks later, the announcement for the Southern Wealth Fund comes out. Could actually be that the US isn't buying Bitcoin directly here. But actually here, spot Bitcoin ETFs are being bought. And I said that back then too. If they're buying Bitcoin ETFs from BlackRock, then that would definitely make sense, because the US has basically put its stamp of power on BlackRock. So if the US later says, okay, we need to censor this, we need to expropriate the Bitcoin ETFs, and so on, then that's possible. But if Russia were to buy Bitcoin ETFs from BlackRock, then it wouldn't make any sense, because Russia can't censor here. Russia has no sovereignty over the assets. That means for Russia, for someone outside the US, it definitely makes more sense to hold their own keys. If you're the US itself and you have the Bitcoin spot product in the U.S, and also the crap that's going on here at Coinbase in the U.S, then it can definitely make sense to buy Bitcoin ETFs here for the Sovereign Wealth Fund instead of buying Bitcoin directly. Although it would also be better for the U.S. They would have direct Bitcoin. They also have direct Bitcoin, the confiscated Bitcoin. But now the question is, what are you going to do with the stockpile? What are you going to do with the wealth fund? Do it directly, do it through Bitcoin ETFs. We'll see how that goes. And then the Bitcoin ETF expert Eric Balciunas actually said something interesting here. And he says here, or he posts this here in the end. Bitcoin is set to hit 500K by 2028. Here is Standard Charters. He's spouting hopium again and says Bitcoin will hit 500,000 by the end of Trump's term, reach 500,000 US dollars. So by 2028. To be honest, their crazy Bitcoin ETF flow prediction was actually more accurate than ours. So who knows? And what that ultimately means is, I don't quite remember the prediction here, that Standard Charters also predicted. That Bitcoin is definitely seeing a lot of inflows is thanks to the Bitcoin ETFs. And a lot of people were really very reserved. At first, it didn't go so crazy, But then you saw it. It has increased more and more throughout the year. There's never been such a drastic downturn. Sure, there were always a few weeks where it was a bit weaker. There were also a few weeks where outflows happened and stuff like that. Or a few days, not really weeks, more like days. But here Standard Chartered has already said, okay, hey, there are going to be massive inflows, and a lot of people, including me, are also expecting that. That definitely in 2025, the inflows for the Bitcoin ETFs from BlackRock will go up again. I also predicted that at the beginning of the year. The inflows this year will likely be higher than last year. And what if such news comes in now? Like how Europe is also betting on Bitcoin ETFs, in the form of BlackRock and so on. By the way, this whole thing is being launched here in Switzerland, just like it says here. Then, of course, the likelihood that this whole thing blows up and pops off is pretty high. Very, very likely. And then there's also the thing with the 500,000. Very, very exciting. If they also really called the Bitcoin ETF flows correctly here. And a lot of people were being very, very bearish about it. And the wallet, here now at 500,000, US dollar Bitcoin price. Someone down below also writes, that corresponds to an average annual growth of 50% and is therefore below the average since 2020. The average is, I think, around 54, 56% or something like that. And that's without the ongoing ETF offerings. That's not a crazy prediction. Based on the recent historical charges, so the compound annual growth rates, it's averaging, if not even a bit pessimistic. That means by 2028, 500,000. The US dollar Bitcoin price isn't necessarily hyper bullish. Some people are predicting that for this year. But a Bitcoin price of 500,000 US dollars in 2028, so 500,000, is more on the bearish side. And yeah, it's probably not bearish either, but more on the conservative side. I mean, this year 500,000 is definitely very, very ambitious and so on. There are people who say that, but I would approach it a bit more, let's say. Take it easy. Okay. Because it's always better to undershoot than to overshoot. If everyone is assuming that, okay, it absolutely has to hit 500,000. Then it goes to 200,000 and everyone is disappointed. But if you aim for 200,000 and then it goes to 500,000, then you're really happy. Much more. Here's the big recommendation. I'll put the link down below. 21 Bitcoin, how you can easily, safely, and simply buy Bitcoin with the code HODL. You can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin here. Absolutely recommend it. We need to pay very close attention now, how this continues, because this could definitely be another step here. To anchor Bitcoin more here, in Europe, in the EU. And if it doesn't come voluntarily, that the regulation opens up and so on, then they'll just be forced to do it sooner or later. As British HODL says here in the end, I think that's a very, very accurate statement that he's doing here. You can't get around Bitcoin. Adopt or have fun staying poor. And here's a big recommendation for you all. Hey, let's get started. The Bitcoin Advantage starts in 2 days. I'll put a link to the waiting list down below so you can still be a part of this. Only people who are on the waiting list will get guaranteed access. Here for the live call. I'll be presenting a live call here in 2 days. what the Bitcoin advantage is all about. We've really got some crazy and wild things planned here. Here, you can already find some free insights in the Telegram waiting list. So definitely check it out. I'll put a link down here. Guys, see you later. See you then. I'm heading into the sea for a swim. Peace out.